When hope comes from the stars. First Archon Solara stared at the holographic display with all three of her eyes, her scaled skin shifting from azure to a pale gray as wave after wave of devastating reports flooded in. The Void Swarm had breached their outer defense grid, consuming the mineral-rich moons that had sustained Venari civilization for millennia. Their home system, once the proud center of a 12-system confederation, would fall within days. The evacuation of the southern continent is only at 63% completion, Science Director Nariv reported, his voice betraying the exhaustion they all felt after weeks without rest. The orbital platforms cannot accommodate more refugees. Solara's tendrils curled in frustration. And our fleet? Decimated, Defense Commander Thalox answered, displaying tactical readouts on the central projection. The Void Swarm adapted to our phase shift weapons. They're consuming matter at an accelerated rate now, converting our own defenses into more of their kind. The emergency council chamber fell silent. For over 6,000 cycles, the Venari had considered themselves among the most advanced species in their corner of the galaxy. Their understanding of quantum mechanics and gravitational engineering had allowed them to reshape worlds, create stable wormholes, and defend against conventional threats. But the Void Swarm was something else entirely. A collective intelligence that operated on principles they couldn't comprehend, consuming everything in its path like a cosmic plague. "We have one option remaining," Solara finally said, her voice steady despite the despair threatening to overwhelm her. "We broadcast on all frequencies, in all mathematical formats we know. Perhaps someone, somewhere, will hear us." "Who?" Nariv asked bitterly. "The Juriani. They're isolationists who haven't responded to communications in 300 cycles. The Myth Collective. They're too far to reach us in time." "Anyone," Solara replied. "Everyone. We can't be the only ones who've encountered this threat." With unanimous agreement, the first in many cycles of political division, the Venari transmitted their distress call. A complex mathematical sequence detailing their location, the nature of the threat, and a desperate plea that transcended language barriers. "Help us." For 3 days, as the Void Swarm consumed their outer planets, they received nothing but silence in return. Solara ordered the final evacuation protocols, knowing they were merely postponing the inevitable. Their generation ships could sustain perhaps a third of their population, but with no destination and limited resources, extinction was merely a question of time. Then, as hope dwindled to its final embers, their communications array detected something unusual. First Archon, the communications officer called, his scales flashing with excitement. "We're receiving a response." The council gathered around as the message was decoded. It was crude by Venari standards, simple binary translated into basic mathematical concepts, but unmistakably intelligent. Message reads, "Hang tight. Help is coming." It's followed by an identification sequence unknown to our databases, the officer reported. "Can you trace the origin?" Thalox demanded. "That's impossible," the officer replied, checking his instruments. According to these readings, the message originated from over 70 light cycles away, but was transmitted less than 6 hours ago. Before anyone could process this information, the sensor arrays erupted with alerts. Spatial distortions were forming at the edge of their system, not the chaotic rifts caused by the Void Swarm, but precise, controlled tears in the fabric of space-time. Multiple objects emerging, Thalox announced, his military training keeping his voice level despite his evident shock. Hundreds of them. Configuration unknown. The holographic display shifted to show vessels unlike any the Venari had encountered. Where Venari ships were elegant, crystalline structures flowing with symmetrical precision, these newcomers were an eclectic mix of designs, some sleek and angular, others bulky and imposing, all moving with coordinated purpose. "We're receiving visual transmission from the lead vessel," the communications officer reported. The council chamber's main display flickered to life, revealing a creature that caused many Venari to step back in surprise. It stood upright on two limbs, with two additional appendages clearly used for manipulation rather than locomotion. Its skin appeared soft and vulnerable, covering a clearly endoskeletal frame. Most striking was its face, flat, with a protruding nasal structure and exposed dentition when it spoke. "Greetings, people of Venari Prime. I am Admiral Helena Chen of the United Earth Defense Force. We received your distress call and have come to render assistance. The entities you call the Void Swarm are known to us as the Phage. We've encountered them before." Silara stepped forward, overcoming her initial shock. How did you receive our message and arrive so quickly? Our records show no awareness of your species. The human, as they would later learn to call these beings, smiled, an expression the Venari would come to recognize as signifying confidence rather than aggression. "We've been developing experimental FTL technology. Your distress call gave us a reason to field test it at scale. As for why you don't know us, well, we tend to stay quiet until we're needed. May we establish a direct communication link with your command structure? Time is limited." Within hours, the human fleet had positioned itself throughout the Venari system. Their ships, a diverse array that suggested multiple design philosophies rather than the unified approach the Venari employed, moved with remarkable coordination. Smaller vessels scouted the advancing Void Swarm, while larger ones established defensive positions around Venari Prime. In the hastily organized Joint Command Center, Admiral Chen explained their strategy. "The Phage, what you call the Void Swarm, operates by destabilizing matter at the quantum level, converting it into energy they can use to replicate," she explained, displaying holographic models. "They're not invincible. They're just operating on principles you haven't encountered before." Science Director Nereve studied the humans' data with growing astonishment. "You've developed countermeasures. In how long?" "We first encountered a phage probe about 15 Earth years ago," replied Dr. Abayoni Okafor, the human fleet's chief scientist. "It nearly destroyed a research outpost before we contained it. We've been preparing for a larger incursion ever since." 15 cycles. Phlox questioned incredulously. "You developed quantum stabilization technology in 15 cycles." "Well, we had some good motivation," Dr. Okafor said with a shrug. "Nothing accelerates human innovation like an existential threat." As the Void Swarm approached the inner system, the humans deployed their countermeasures. Thousands of small devices were scattered throughout strategic points in space, creating what Admiral Chen called a quantum stabilization grid. When the first wave of the swarm encountered this grid, their matter conversion process faltered. "Now," Chen ordered, and the human fleet moved with practiced precision. Their weapons were unlike anything the Venari had conceived, not because they were more advanced, but because they approached the problem from entirely different angles. Where Venari weapons focused on disruption and destabilization, human weapons combined brute force with surgical precision. Missiles carrying exotic payloads, energy weapons that targeted specific frequencies, and most surprisingly, kinetic weapons that simply accelerated physical projectiles to relativistic speeds. Why would they use physical projectiles? Nereve asked, watching the battle unfold. "It's so primitive. Sometimes the old ways work best," Phlox observed, his military mind appreciating the elegance of the approach. The swarm adapted to energy-based attacks, but physical impacts still disrupt their cohesion. The first engagement ended with the Void Swarm retreating to regroup, something the Venari had never witnessed before. In the command center, a mixture of hope and disbelief permeated the air. "How?" Silara finally asked Admiral Chen directly. "How is your species capable of this? According to our understanding of technological development, you shouldn't have achieved interstellar travel for another 1,000 cycles, let alone developed quantum stabilization technology." Chen exchanged glances with her officers before responding. "First Archon, humanity has a somewhat unique development pattern. We don't advance linearly. We leap forward in bursts, usually when faced with challenges, and we have a particular talent for warfare. Your warriors." Thalox asked, his scales shifting with new wariness. Not exactly, Chen replied. We're survivors. Throughout our history, we faced extinction-level threats, some from nature, some of our own making. Each time, we've adapted, and we've learned that the most dangerous moment is the one when you believe you've run out of options. As the human fleet prepared for the next engagement, Sci-Fi watched these strange aliens with growing fascination. They moved with purpose, but also with an energy the methodical Venari rarely displayed. They argued openly, laughed in the face of danger, and modified their plans with seemingly reckless speed. Your species is chaotic, she observed to Chen. The Admiral smiled. That's our greatest strength, First Archon. The Void Swarm operates on predictable patterns, consuming and adapting systematically. But humans, we're anything but systematic when our backs are against the wall. As the Void Swarm regrouped for a second assault, the Venari watched in awe as humanity demonstrated exactly what Admiral Chen meant. The most dangerous beings in the galaxy had indeed arrived, but they had come as saviors, not destroyers. The fire within. The temporary respite did not last long. Within 12 hours, the Void Swarm had regrouped, its collective intelligence adapting to the human quantum stabilization grid. What had once been an amorphous mass of consuming entities now moved with disturbing coordination, targeting the grid's weakest points. They're learning faster than we anticipated, Admiral Chen observed in the Joint Command Center, her calm demeanor belied by the tension in her shoulders. The stabilization grid won't hold against a concentrated assault. Defense Commander Thalox, who had been studying human battle tactics with growing respect, gestured to the holographic display. They're demonstrating actual strategy now. See how they're focusing on these 3 sectors. They're creating a breach point. Adaptation was expected, Dr. Okafor noted, his fingers dancing across his data terminal. But this level of strategic response suggests higher intelligence than our previous encounters. They're evolving. First Archon Sci-Fi, who had not left the command center since the humans' arrival, felt her hard-won hope beginning to fade. Then we're merely delaying the inevitable. Not at all, Chen replied with startling confidence. We planned for this. The grid was Phase 1. It forced them to change their behavior. Now we implement Phase 2. With swift efficiency, the human fleet reconfigured. Smaller vessels pulled back while larger ships moved into new formations. To the Venari observers, the maneuvers appeared chaotic, even reckless, but Chen assured them this was intentional. Unpredictability is key, she explained. The swarm adapts to patterns, so we give them none. What followed was a demonstration of warfare unlike anything the Venari had witnessed in 6 millennia of interstellar conflict. Human ships performed maneuvers that seemed to defy physics, their engines pushing structural tolerances to limits that made Venari engineers wince. They deployed new weapons, devices that created localized time dilation fields, trapping portions of the swarm in temporal bubbles where they could be methodically destroyed. How did you develop time manipulation technology? Science Director Neriv asked incredulously, watching as a human destroyer deployed what they called chronometric charges against a swarm cluster. Necessity, replied Dr. Okafor with a shrug. The theory existed for decades. When the phage threatened Earth, suddenly the funding and ethical restrictions stopping us from testing it disappeared. This pattern repeated throughout the battle, the humans revealing technologies that by themselves weren't necessarily more advanced than Venari achievements, but applied in ways the Venari had never considered. Their approach to science wasn't the methodical, generation-spanning research the Venari practiced, but rather a frenzied, almost desperate innovation driven by immediate needs. During a brief lull in the fighting, as both sides regrouped, Sci-Fi found Admiral Chen alone in the observation dome, watching the distant flashes of combat where her fleet engaged swarm remnants. Your people fight with remarkable conviction, Sci-Fi observed, choosing her words carefully. Chen smiled tiredly. We fight like our survival depends on it, because it does. Not just yours, but ours too. The phage wouldn't stop with Venari Prime. If they consumed your technology, they'd become an even greater threat to Earth. So this is self-preservation? Sylara asked, trying to understand these aliens who had arrived so unexpectedly. Partly, Chen acknowledged. But there's more to it. When we received your transmission, those mathematical sequences coupled with such unmistakable distress, something fundamental in human nature responded. We've always been explorers, first Archon, driven to discover what lies beyond the next horizon. But we're also protectors. Something in us rises to the defense of others, sometimes even at our own expense. Before Sylara could respond, alarms sounded throughout the command center. The Void Swarm had adapted again, this time bypassing the quantum stabilization grid entirely through a technique that even the human scientists couldn't immediately explain. They're accelerating their evolution, Dr. Okafor reported grimly. They're incorporating elements of our own technology into their structure. The chronometric charges are no longer effective. For the first time since their arrival, Sylara saw uncertainty in the humans' expressions. The swarm's new configuration was moving directly toward Venari Prime, ignoring the military targets to focus on the planet itself. If they consume your world, Chen stated flatly, they'll gain access to all your advanced gravitational technology. With that, they could create artificial singularities. No world would be safe. In the crisis room, human and Venari scientists worked feverishly to develop new countermeasures. The collaborative process revealed stark differences in their approaches. Where Venari science relied on elegant, thoroughly tested theories, human science embraced improvisation and calculated risks. This might work, Nariv said, displaying a complex formula for a gravitational inversion field. But the calculations would take days to verify, and implementation would require resources we don't have. We don't need days, responded Lieutenant Commander Yuna Takahashi, Chen's tactical officer. We need solutions now. What if we bypass the theoretical framework and go straight to application? Your gravity manipulation technology combined with our phase-shifting capabilities. Without proper testing, the energetic feedback alone could create a cascading reaction that would tear apart the fabric of local spacetime, Nariv objected. Yes, Takahashi agreed with unsettling calm. But it would also destroy the swarm. Completely. The Venari scientists recoiled at such a reckless proposal, but to their shock, Admiral Chen didn't dismiss it outright. Containment radius, she asked. 3 light minutes minimum, Dr. Okafor calculated. We'd lose a significant portion of the fleet, but Venari Prime would be safe. Absolutely not, Sylara interjected, her scales flushing deep crimson. We will not allow you to sacrifice yourselves. Chen's expression softened. First Archon, humanity has a long tradition of calculated sacrifice for the greater good. But before we resort to that, I believe there's another option. The plan that emerged was audacious even by human standards. Using Venari gravitational technology, they would create a localized spatial fold, essentially a controllable singularity, and draw the swarm into it. The human fleet would then use their phase-shifting technology to stabilize the fold's perimeter, preventing it from expanding beyond the target zone. The risks, Nariv began, are acceptable, Chen finished firmly. We've run the simulations, 78% chance of success. And the other 22%? Thalox asked. Let's focus on the 78. Chen replied with a grim smile. As the plan was implemented, Venari and human crews worked side by side. Despite their physiological differences and the communication challenges, a strange camaraderie developed. 2 species united by a common threat and a shared determination to survive. The final battle unfolded with breathtaking speed. The Venari gravitational engines, reconfigured according to human specifications, created the spatial fold directly in the swarm's path. As expected, the collective intelligence recognized the threat and attempted to change course. But the human fleet had anticipated this, positioning phase shifters to herd the swarm toward the singularity. From the command center, Sylara watched with all three eyes wide as the void swarm, the existential threat that had consumed dozens of Venari worlds, was drawn inexorably into the swirling vortex of distorted space-time. The human ships danced around the perimeter, their engines straining as they maintained the delicate balance between containment and catastrophe. "Collapse imminent," reported a human officer, her voice tense. "All ships, execute emergency withdrawal." In a synchronized maneuver, the human fleet pulled back as the spatial fold reached critical mass. For a moment, space itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the singularity collapsed upon itself with a flash of energy that temporarily overloaded all sensors. When the systems came back online, the void swarm was gone. The celebration that followed transcended species differences. Venari, who had never before experienced physical contact, found themselves embraced by jubilant humans. Their biochemically different bodies responded to emotional states that, despite evolving on worlds 70 light-years apart, proved remarkably similar in moments of profound relief. In the days that followed, as recovery efforts began, Sylara sought out Admiral Chen. The human commander was overseeing repairs to her flagship, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Your people are preparing to leave," Sylara observed. Chen nodded. "The immediate threat is contained, and we have responsibilities elsewhere. But we'll leave behind a contingent to help with reconstruction and technology exchange. The galaxy just got smaller, First Archon. We should get to know our neighbors." "Why?" Sylara asked, the question that had lingered since the humans' arrival finally finding voice. Why risk everything for a species you never knew existed until days ago? Chen considered the question with unexpected seriousness. "There's something I've been thinking about since we received your transmission. In all our history, humans have wondered if we're alone in the universe. We've searched the stars for signs of other intelligence, both hoping for and fearing the answer." She gazed up at the viewport, where Venari Prime shone against the blackness of space. "When we heard your call, that mathematical sequence layered with such unmistakable emotion, something clicked into place. Not just the scientific validation that other intelligent life exists, but the recognition of a shared experience. You were afraid. You needed help. Those feelings transcend biology," Archon Sylara. "So it was. Empathy," Sylara suggested, the concept familiar yet somehow different in this context. "Partly," Chen agreed, "but also something else. Humans have always defined themselves by the challenges we overcome. We climbed mountains because they were there. We crossed oceans because the horizon beckoned. We reached for the stars because we couldn't bear not knowing what lay beyond them." She smiled, a gesture Sylara was beginning to appreciate for its emotional transparency. "When we heard your call echoing across 70 light-years of void, we couldn't not answer. It's who we are." As the human fleet prepared for departure, a formal alliance was established between Earth and Venari Prime, the first interspecies accord in Venari history. The treaty, simple by Venari diplomatic standards, but profound in its implications, included provisions for cultural exchange, technological cooperation, and mutual defense. Standing in the newly established Earth Embassy, Sylara reflected on the unexpected turn of events. Her people had broadcast a desperate plea into the darkness, expecting silence in return. Instead, they had found not just allies, but a species whose chaotic, innovative nature complemented their own methodical approach to existence. The Void Swarm had nearly ended Venari civilization. Instead, it had introduced them to humanity, a species whose response to a cry for help from strangers was to cross 70 light-years with experimental technology and fight as if the threat were to their own world. Perhaps, Sylara thought as she watched the stars where Earth lay far beyond sight, the most dangerous beings in the galaxy were exactly what the universe needed.